Hello, thank you for joining in on this recording. My name is Christy Gabbard. I'm the founder of Local Concepts, and my business partner, Sonia Kiner, and I have been working over the last year for the Chesapeake Bay Trust and for an advisory team of the Chesapeake Bay Program Education Workgroup. We've been working to better understand the people, organizations, networks, and agencies supporting environmental education. You were invited to this presentation because you are recognized as a leader in the environmental education movement, or because you're recognized as a leader in the formal education system. And whether or not you've ever thought about it this way, you are part of a fairly large network of people and organizations working to educate youth. Before digging into the presentation, I want to share just a little bit about Local Concepts. Sonia and I deeply believe that intentionally designed and managed networks are a very effective way to accelerate the pace of change around values and visions that people and organizations share. We specialize in network design and management. We offer organizational development and strategic planning support. We develop creative communications and communication pathways, and we also provide event, meeting, and program design support. Today, what I'll share with you is what we learned and what we heard from the environmental education stakeholders from across the region about the current conditions for environmental literacy, both the challenges and opportunities. We'll also provide a brief overview of networks and the benefits of networks, and I'll offer some recommendations for strengthening the existing environmental literacy networks moving forward. We'll also provide space in here to hear from you and ways to hear from you. We want to know if this makes sense to you and if this is something you can get behind. So let's start with the current environmental literacy ecosystem and what we heard from stakeholders about challenges and recommendations. In support of the 2014 Chesapeake Bay Agreement environmental literacy goal, the Chesapeake Bay Program Education Workgroup has a vision, and that vision is all students graduating environmentally literate, all students. And embracing this vision could have significant impacts on education and on people. According to Dr. Mark Stern, who's with the Virginia Tech School of Forest Resources and Environmental Conservation, peer-reviewed literature from the last decade demonstrates that good environmental education programs can positively influence a student's academic performance, knowledge base, skills, confidence, motivation, and behavior. So it has really far-reaching positive impacts. Environmental education does. And in April of 2020, Local Concepts was selected by an advisory group to the Chesapeake Bay Program Education Workgroup to conduct an assessment to determine whether an outdoor learning network could increase communication across partners and networks to support environmental literacy, and whether an outdoor learning network could increase the number of teacher-supported systemic environmental literacy programs. To inform the assessment, between July and December of 2020, we connected with 42 formal and non-formal educators from 5 states and Washington, D.C. We also talked with some decision makers and we spoke with these folks through a series of interviews and focus groups. So throughout this presentation, I will use the words formal to refer to teachers and others in the pre-K through 12 education system. And I'll use the word non-formal to refer to environmental educators that often work for nonprofits or government agencies. I know there are a number of folks here that gave their time to be interviewed, or they have participated in a focus group. And I want to thank you. I want to thank you for the time that you gave us. Your information was very valuable to this process and so informative. In addition, throughout this process, there was an advisory team that met twice a month and provided critical thinking and informative feedback. The advisory team included Tom Ackerman, Tara Drennan, Shannon Sprague, Elise Trelligan, Casey Wetzel, and Olivia Wisner. Sonia and I learned a whole lot from this crew and are continually inspired by their strategic thinking and their care and commitment to the Chesapeake Bay. So now let's get into what we learned, and we'll start with what seems to be working well. We learned that the Chesapeake Bay Program Education Workgroup is having a positive impact. And for those of you that may not be familiar with the Education Workgroup, they are one of 5 work groups that make up the Fostering Chesapeake Stewardship Goal Implementation Team. And they are working to advance the Chesapeake Bay Agreement environmental literacy goal. The Education Workgroup aims to increase outdoor education, support teacher training with things like the Bay Backpack Program, and they support environmental literacy planning. In many ways, the Education Workgroup acts like a network. The work group brings people together that value environmental education, and it provides a way to connect people, share resources, and provide professional development. We heard from stakeholders that they really value the bridges the work group builds between the formal and non-formal education communities. They really value the work they do to onboard new stewards. And perhaps most importantly, the regional goals and strategy that the work group helps to set are being used by organizations and school districts and others to move their programs and their goals and priorities forward. So that work, the work that the Chesapeake Bay Program Education Workgroup is doing a lot of things really well in supporting environmental education. We also heard from stakeholders some of the challenges, and most people that participated in the assessment, when asked, felt that the existing capacity for environmental education is not currently sufficient to ensure that all students graduate environmentally literate by 2025. Even though there is a tremendous amount of work being done to advance environmental education in schools across the region, we heard time and again that that work is happening in pockets and it is not evenly distributed across states or even within a state. And even though we interviewed people from 5 states and from Washington, D.C., there were some challenges that were shared and they came up time and again. These include policies and prioritization and the fact that there's a lack of systemic integration of environmental education in school policies or in curricula and in the standards of learning. And environmental education does not appear to be prioritized by most decision makers. So that makes it really challenging to get environmental education into the school policies and into the lessons teachers are sharing with their students. There's also a need for more capacity building and for more, including professional development for both the non-formal educators and the formal educators. Where we are seeing environmental education integrated into school programs most successfully is where there's a close working relationship between the non-formals and the formal educators. But there are not enough non-formal educators to connect to all the formal educators, and they're stretched really thin as it is. And we heard from the formal educators that there's a need to kind of build their professional development acumen so that they're able to do this work without as much support. Part of that, though, is making environmental education more relevant to the formal educators, because those educators and the administrators, they often don't see the value in how environmental education can advance their goals and their assessment measures. In addition, we heard that language that's used when talking about environmental education often doesn't feel relevant. It can often feel jargony and unfamiliar. So it's important that we use language when talking about environmental education that is shared by all. And lastly, stakeholders recommended that environmental education approaches need to be relevant to the people involved by leveraging local places and assets. So really making the environmental education community centered and focused on wherever the teachers and students are. Champions for environmental literacy are a driving force, and they hold such important know-how. And what we heard time and again was once you lose an environmental education ambassador, there's a really large gap in knowledge and relationships. And it's that knowledge and those relationships that are key to this work, and they take time to establish. So there's a need to help retain champions for environmental education, but also to create pathways for bringing on new champions. And you won't be surprised to hear that funding and lack of consistent funding to support teacher training and environmental education implementation is also a challenge. People stress that funding cannot fall on the schools, teachers, or families to support. Funding environmental education cannot fall on them to support. It really needs to be baked into the system. So here are a couple recommendations that stakeholders that participated in the assessment provided. And the overwhelming majority of those that participated agreed a network or a strengthening of existing networks would likely address some of the challenges that I just mentioned. And a network would also help to facilitate more connectivity and eventually more collective action. Networks are an excellent way for people to drive change around shared values, especially for issues that no single organization can solve alone. And environmental education is one of those. The large majority of both the formal and non-formal participants in the assessment expressed that a statewide network for environmental educators, one designed to connect people, broadcast resources, offer professional development, and provide advocacy support, would add tremendous value to their work and would help to advance systemic environmental literacy. We also heard that a decision maker network or some way to more effectively engage decision makers is needed to advance policies and to change the standards of learning to include environmental education. Emphasis here should be placed on connecting with decision makers in the formal education system. So connecting with people like superintendents, school board representatives, policymakers, and other influencers. And to avoid duplicating efforts, the people really stressed that the importance of reinforcing the existing environmental education ecosystem by resourcing, empowering, and aligning people, organizations, networks, and others that are already engaged in this work. They also stressed the importance of prioritizing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion principles and strategies moving forward. So now let's talk a little bit about the benefits of networks, since this was recommended by stakeholders. And I suspect most of you are familiar with networks and you participate in informal networks all the time. And as I mentioned before, networks exist when people come together. Networks exist when people come together around shared values. And those shared values and the shared vision are basically the heart of the network. And then the communication pathways are the lifeline of any network. And networks can really accelerate the pace of change because they facilitate shared learning and relationship building. They help to elevate community voices, and they help to scale successful models. Networks, though, are most effective when care is taken to intentionally and strategically design them to add value to each participant, as well as to the network as a whole. With proper care and management, a network can have powerful impacts, really setting the stage for collaboration and innovation. So pictured here are what we call the network building blocks. The foundation is all about connections. That is creating ways to strengthen existing relationships and build new relationships, and creating ways to leverage and increase resource flows. And moving up the pyramid is where folks begin to align around a focus, around a specific topic. For example, they may align in a work group or some sort of committee or community of practice. But this is where they begin to see kind of a focus area where a subset of people can start to work together. And this foundation of connections and alignment all builds the capacity for acting together, for collective action. But again, it all starts with that strong foundation that is formed by communication and convening pathways that facilitate meaningful relationships and information sharing. And the really good news is that building that foundation often requires the least amount of risk, since you're just committing to being better connected to one another and to sharing information. Successful networks never underestimate the stability gained from the strong foundation of relationships and trust. And many times, large networks never have to move beyond that low risk foundation. It's often subsets of the networks that move of the network that move into alignment and action. So I told you that would be brief about networks, but now I want to share with you a little bit about the conceptual model of the networks that exist in the region. And building on the stakeholder input from the assessment, I will offer some recommendations for strengthening the environmental literacy ecosystem. So the assessment process revealed, as I have mentioned before, that there is quite a lot of work happening across the watershed to advance environmental literacy. And to some degree, a network of networks already exists among the environmental literacy movement. This conceptual model illustrates what we mean. It illustrates the different levels of environmental literacy networks and how the different levels of networks may interact. So I just want to bring your attention to the bottom right-hand side of the slide. And this is level 1. And this level represents the work happening in school districts within a state. And then moving clockwise along the slide, you'll see level 2, which represents all the work happening at the state level to support formal educators and non-formal educators. And then continuing clockwise is level 3, which represents the formal and non-formal decision makers within each state and across the region. And when we talked to the stakeholders through the assessment process, they affirmed that gaps exist both within each level and across levels from educator to decision maker, and that this occurs in every state, and that it is effectively slowing expansion and systemic integration of environmental education initiatives to date. So more needs to be done at level 1 to scale the periphery, to bring new school districts into the fold, and to build more connections between formal and non-formal educators in these districts to help increase information sharing. Educators express that they want easier access to resources and knowledge, especially resources that center standards of learning and other performance-based assessment measures. We heard that more needs to be done at level 2 to scale out and spread innovation that's happening across each state and to connect the existing formal and non-formal networks. There appears to be a disconnect right now in many places between the formal networks and the non-formal networks that exist. They're doing great work, but they just need to be better connected. And then more needs to be done at level 3 to scale up the work, to influence decision makers, to change policies, practices, and to redirect resources. So in essence, what we're talking about is firming up that foundation of the networks. Remember the bottom of that pyramid. And then, so firming up that foundation that exists by strategically opening up communication pathways between formal and non-formal educators, and strategically opening up those communication pathways from level 1 through level 3 so people can know one another better and that they're sharing more resources, approaches, and information. And again, this is good news because, as I mentioned before, investing in that foundation and building those connections requires the least amount of risk and commitment of resources among network participants. You're not asking people to commit to long-term action together. You're just asking them to know one another better and to share information. So with that, we'd like to hear from you. We'd like to understand how this is sitting with you. So to help with this, we're going to use an interactive presentation software called Mentimeter. And I'm sure many of you may be familiar with Mentimeter, but if you're not, it is not part of Zoom. So what you can do is pause this recording and then go to menti.com. You'll see that here on the slide, and type in the code 54150706, and you'll be prompted to answer a question. At the end of the and after you've answered that first question, you can come back to the presentation. This question is going to really, again, try to understand what it's like in your state and which level needs the most investment of time and resources to ensure all kids have access to environmental education. So here we have the overarching recommendations, which Sonia and I developed. And these recommendations aim to strengthen connections within each level. And they also aim to build bridges between levels and create feedback loops. I'm going to walk through these recommendations looking at a state model of the environmental literacy network of networks. And I'm going to share that model with you in just a second. So for those of you that want to view these recommendations while I walk through the state model, I recommend taking a screenshot of this, or you can open up the infographic that was shared in the invitation to join this presentation. So throughout the assessment process, state level networks emerged as an important scale to focus on. So not necessarily focusing entirely on the local level or on a regional level, but state level networks emerged as an important scale to focus on, because this is where the standards of learning are set. This is where graduation requirements are set and other priorities are set. And without buy-in at this level, local implementation is going to be scattershot and difficult to build out and maintain. So this figure illustrates the different types of people or organizations in the different levels of the environmental literacy network of networks within each state. And it really does look similar across states. So at level 1, here at the bottom of your screen, are the formal and non-formal educators and local decision makers that operate in the communities and districts within a state. These are people like science supervisors, curriculum developers, educators from environmental organizations, school board representatives, and other formal and non-formal educators in the school districts. Moving up is level 2, and this is where we have the statewide formal and non-formal education networks. And an example of a formal education network or network-like entity is a Science Teacher Association, and an example of a non-formal network is an example is the North American Association for Environmental Education affiliates. So there are state affiliates for that North American group that operate again across the state and really serve the non-formal educators. And level 3 is focused on the state level formal education decision makers, because they are ultimately the ones setting the standards of learning and the graduation requirements. Then if you go to the top left of this figure, you'll see the Chesapeake Bay Program Education Workgroup, and they really hold kind of this big regional view, and they serve as a network catalyst and a resource broker. So these are the people, the organizations in this model, and what I'll do moving forward is build out this slide with recommended activities and outcomes for each, and anticipated outcomes for each level. So the first recommendation I'll walk through is the recommendation to connect and resource collaborations between existing statewide formal and non-formal education networks. Initially, we see this support coming from the Chesapeake Bay Education Workgroup and potentially other regional partners like the Chesapeake Bay Program Diversity Workgroup or the Principals Committee, funders, and others. And we recommend that the education work group and the other partners should continue to do the work that they've been doing, serving as what we call a network catalyst and focusing effort on supporting level 2, supporting those statewide networks. Doing things like convening the formal and non-formal networks that exist to better understand their capacity to form some type of ad hoc partnership. The work group can help to leverage the existing communication pathways and distribute resources and information. They can provide professional development, perhaps around JEDI practices and network building strategies to better connect these statewide networks and to strengthen their collective and their individual work. The work group can also offer assessment and evaluation support, doing all of this in an effort to advance the environmental literacy movement. This type of level 2 support will help increase connectivity between the formal and non-formal networks and organizations. It will increase awareness of resources and make them more accessible. It will strengthen the existing networks and facilitate the spread of innovation. In essence, investment here will help to scale connections, learning, and innovative practices across a state. So strengthening the connections between the formals and the non-formal networks in each state is key. And the rest of our recommendations will stem from this level 2 area, where a partnership will stem from this level 2 area. And where a partnership, where we are hoping that a partnership can be formed between the state networks of formal and non-formal educators. And what we will do, stemming from this level 2, is we will kind of look down, so to speak, and talk about ways to engage level 1, and then we'll also look up and talk about ways to engage level 3. So for now, right now, I'm going to focus on recommendation number 2, where we are looking down to level 1. That is, we're looking to strengthen connections and increase information sharing among formal and non-formal educators in priority school districts. To do this, we recommend level 2, that is the partnership or ad hoc partnership between the state formal and non-formal networks, identify network weavers who can connect with district level formal and non-formal educators in each state. So a little bit about network weavers. These are people that are strong communicators, they're sharers of information, and they're environmental education cheerleaders, people that want to help build relationships and spread ideas. But they're also really good listeners, and they're constantly collecting important information about educator interests, local decision maker values, challenges, and capacity building needs. Again, we propose that the statewide networks form some type of ad hoc partnership and together identify network weavers to be dispatched to priority school districts within a state. These weavers will then build relationships among teams of district level formal and non-formal educators. They'll distribute resources like successful curriculum or ELIT tools. They will connect these people to others in the state who have been successful at implementing environmental education in the classroom. The network weavers will also gauge interest in environmental education. They'll gauge interest in environmental education among school district administrators and other personnel, and they'll identify where environmental education has the potential to gain traction and what leaders are supportive. The network weavers will build a bridge between levels 1 and level 2. They will connect level 1 educators to the statewide efforts happening at level 2, again, or that partnership between the statewide formal and non-formal networks. So they'll bring those folks at level 1 and connect them to level 2. And this will help to expand the network and connect level 1 to more knowledge and resources. It will also make those at level 2 more aware of the values and needs and innovative approaches being used at level 1. So next I'll focus on recommendation number 3, which is scaling up and engaging, informing, and influencing decision makers in the formal education system. For this, we recommend engaging a team of what we call network influencers to connect one-on-one with the formal education decision makers that have the power to influence standards of learning and policies. These are people, again, like superintendents or directors of departments of education and others. Network influencers may be identified by and may even come from folks that operate at level 2 or people from the Chesapeake Bay Program Education Workgroup, for example. Specifically, their job is to distribute strategic messaging and influence the decision makers to help build environmental education champions among formal education decision makers, many of whom at this point do not seem to be fully involved in the environmental literacy movement. Network influencers will work to better understand leverage points and values that are held by these decision makers. Network influencers will also connect with level 1 network weavers to gather intel on supportive decision makers at the local level or level 1 and connect those level 1 decision makers to those at level 3. Over time, we envision investment in network influencers will increase awareness of the importance of environmental literacy among formal education decision makers. They'll increase the number of level 3 champions and advocates and set the stage for changes to policies and standards of learning that prioritize environmental literacy. In addition, mechanisms will be put into place to create feedback loops to the Chesapeake Bay Program Education Workgroup to inform ELIT assessments and other regional and national work. Ultimately, all this will increase the spread of environmental literacy innovation and practices and the number of students receiving environmental education in each state. So none of these recommendations will be successful without buy-in and support from the education community, both the formal and non-formal educators and their support providers. So we've created 2 more questions in Menti to help us understand how the recommendations are sitting with you and to better understand where you see your work fitting into these 3 levels. So please take a minute. Again, you can pause this recording, go to menti.com and type in the code 54150706 and answer the next 2 questions. So, a future where all students graduate environmentally literate is possible, and the network infrastructure to support that vision is there. It just needs to be reinforced. It needs to be better connected and aligned, and it needs to be better resourced. The Chesapeake Bay Program Education Workgroup and other partners are committed to strengthening the environmental education network ecosystem and want you to be involved. Thank you for joining in on this presentation. We definitely want to hear from you. You can reach out to me or Sonia anytime at our email addresses listed here.